There are mornings when you open your eyes, before you can even think about work, before you can remember who you are. Your heart already feels heavy as if crushed by a rock. There is no clear reason, no incident, no bad news. It is just a feeling of exhaustion, vague, as if you had just gone through a long dream without getting any rest. Some people call it aimless sadness, some call it being tired of life, and some silently ask themselves a question they dare not speak aloud. Why is life so painful? That suffering doesn't have to be huge. Sometimes it's just a message not replied to as expected. A look that suddenly turns cold. A fitful sleep that leaves the mind empty the next morning. And so, even before doing anything, people feel like they are carrying something invisible from very early on. Many people are used to jumping to conclusions. My fate must be miserable, or my life was born to be this way. But the strange thing is, if you go back to the very first teaching of the Buddha after his enlightenment, you will hear a sentence not much different from that feeling. Life is suffering. It does not dodge. It does not soften. It adds no hope. Right in the first sermon, the Buddha called it by its name, the truth of suffering dukkha, a non-negotiable truth. And it is right here that many people begin to misunderstand. Upon hearing this, they frown immediately. They think Buddhism is a gloomy path. They assume that saying life is suffering means denying joy, denying the meaning of life, denying happiness. But that is the understanding of someone who hasn't heard the whole sentence. Because pessimism lies not in seeing suffering, but in not seeing a way out. The Buddha was not someone standing before life to complain. He was someone who looked straight at the entire map of suffering and pointed out the path to escape it. Just like a physician, the first task is not to give sweet medicine but to diagnose the disease correctly. If one dares not speak the truth that the body is sick, then every remedy is just a sedative. The Buddha was the same. When saying life is suffering, he was not condemning life. He was waking humans up from the habit of living in delusion. The truth of suffering is not a full stop. It is the first door. What needs to be seen clearly is that the suffering the Buddha pointed out lies not only in the pains everyone recognizes like illness, loss, separation, poverty. Those are just the tip of the iceberg. The deeper, more persistent suffering is a subtle sense of insecurity, always silently present in every moment, even when smiling, even when having just achieved a desire, even when thinking one is happy. Every time something is achieved, the joy usually doesn't last long. Instead, a new worry replaces it, the fear of loss. Every time one loves deeply, attachments arise in the heart. Every time life is stable, a part of the mind has already begun to worry about the day it changes. It is not because life is too cruel, but because humans refuse to accept the truth that everything is impermanent. We know that with our intellect, but in our hearts, we always resist it. We want to keep, want to hold, want everything to stand still, and that very wanting is where suffering begins. Therefore, saying life is suffering does not mean life is meaningless. On the contrary, it means life is operating exactly according to its nature. Everything is born, exists, and then changes. Suffering is not because life is wrong, but because humans do not want to live in accordance with that truth. We hurt not only because we are wounded, but also because we do not accept that we are hurting. We suffer not only because of loss but because we refuse to let go. When this is seen, a very important thing begins to be revealed. Suffering is not destiny. It is not a sentence reserved for anyone. It is a mechanism, a natural consequence. Just like when gripping a hot coal, the hand will get burned, not because the coal is evil, nor because the hand is sinful, but simply because that action produces that result. And when this insight is deep enough, people begin to stop blaming life, stop blaming themselves. No need for anyone to promise that after suffering there will be heaven. No need for anyone to paint an ideal future. One just needs to let go right where they are holding on. But right here, another question appears, silent but persistent. If instinct always wants to cling, how can one let go? If the mind always seeks safety, how can one face the truth of impermanence without fear? That question is not meant to be answered in a rush. It opens up a deeper layer of suffering, a layer where the more one wants to escape, the deeper one sinks. And to see that, one needs to look straight into the way the mind operates every time suffering arises. When people begin to look straight at suffering, a very strange paradox gradually appears. The more one wants happiness, the more one suffers. The more one desires stability, the more insecure the heart becomes. Not because the desire is wrong, but because that very desire has placed the human in a position of opposition to reality. Reality is as it is, while in the mind there is always a different image of how it should be. And the gap between what is and what should be is where suffering silently breeds. Observe carefully a moment of deep suffering in life. Usually, it is not because the event itself is too cruel, but because it did not happen the way we expected. We want a person to stay, they leave. We want a stable job, the world changes. We want to keep a period of peace, a crisis strikes. In that very moment, suffering comes not only from loss but from the resistance in the mind. We refuse to let the event be as it is. From very early on, humans are taught that living is to pursue happiness. But very rarely are we taught that happiness cannot be achieved by chasing after it. We grow up with a wrong map. We believe that if we have enough money, enough love, enough fame, enough safety, then suffering will disappear. But then, when achieving each thing one by one, suffering does not leave. It only changes shape. It becomes more sophisticated, quieter, and tougher. The wanting in humans never stops. When not having it, it demands. When having it, it fears losing it. When safe, it worries about uncertainty. When settled, it wants more, from a new pair of shoes to a perfect relationship, from a bigger house to the reputation of a virtuous person. Suffering lies not only in failure but right inside success that feels insufficient. And so, even when everything seems fine, in the heart there is still an unnamed void, a vague feeling of absence, an anxiety with no clear reason. Modern humans are particularly used to living with this state, busy, successful, having many relationships, but just needing to lie down at night for emptiness to rush in. Just a moment of silence brings panic. Just doing nothing makes one feel meaningless. The Buddha did not teach to run away from suffering. He also did not teach finding happiness to replace suffering. He taught to stop to see what is operating in the mind every time suffering arises. When looking closely enough, one will see a very subtle stream of energy driving every reaction. That is the desire to escape suffering. But the paradox lies here. Wanting to end suffering to be happy is still suffering. Wanting peace to avoid insecurity is still insecurity. Wanting to practice spiritually to achieve enlightenment is still craving. Humans rarely live fully with the moment they have. We are always preparing for a different, better state of living, always thinking that after finishing this task I will be at peace. After having enough money I will be happy. After practicing long enough I will be enlightened. But while the mind keeps looking towards the future, this present moment, no matter how full, is forgotten. Suffering is born the very second we are no longer fully present in the here and now. This is the quietest suffering, not noisy, not dramatic, but persistent. It makes humans never truly be at rest. Not at rest in joy, not at rest in sadness, not at rest within their own body and mind. We live as if we always have to become someone else, a better version, more peaceful, more enlightened. And that very pressure causes suffering to never leave. Wanting to end suffering is the primary suffering. When this is seen, another door begins to open slightly, not the door of solutions, but the door of truth. From here, humans can begin to look deeper into their own suffering, not to run away, but to understand, not to deny, but to recognize. And to do that, one needs to go into the deeper structure of suffering, where the Buddha pointed out that suffering does not have just one shape, but has many layers, many levels interwoven and feeding each other. If looking at suffering only as a passing sensation, humans will always find ways to extinguish it. But the Buddha went further than that. He pointed out that suffering is not just a feeling but a structure operating silently in every thought, every reaction, every breath. And if that structure is not seen, every effort to escape suffering is just changing seats in the same circle. In the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha did not stop at saying life is suffering. He analyzed suffering into many layers, many levels, from coarse to subtle, so humans can recognize suffering the moment it just sprouts, instead of only seeing it when it is too late. The first level is suffering of suffering KCH. This is the suffering everyone knows. Everyone has experienced hunger, cold, illness, unemployment, loss of loved ones, breakups, betrayal, insults, body in pain, mind in pain. The pain is clear like a bleeding cut. Because it is so clear, it is easy to name, easy to complain about, and sometimes easy to find ways to overcome when circumstances change. When the wound heals, people often think that suffering has ended, but suffering does not stop there. When the first level of suffering settles down, another level begins to reveal itself, quieter but tougher. That is suffering of change, the suffering of disappearance. The suffering when the things that once made us happy begin to change. A relationship once sweet gradually fades. A body once healthy begins to ache. A belief once solid suddenly wavers. At this level, people are not in intense pain but begin to worry, regret, and feel insecure. Suffering of change does not come because of lack but because of the fear of loss. People in love also suffer because they worry one day that love will dissolve. People who are successful also suffer because they don't know when the halo will dim. People who are stable also suffer because of the worry of sudden incidents. Suffering is born from the very clinging to what one has, while their nature is impermanent. And the more one wants to keep, the greater the fear of loss. That fear becomes a shadow that never leaves. But the deepest, most subtle, and also most common is suffering of conditioned states (KCH). This level of suffering encompasses both levels above and creeps into every corner of modern life. It is the weariness of a person who doesn't know why they are living, only knowing that if they don't do something, if they don't move forward, if they don't improve, they feel meaningless. A ceaseless driving force makes the mind never able to stay still. Suffering of conditioned states does not take the shape of clear pain. It hides behind very beautiful shells, striving, dedication, self-development, living to the fullest. But deep inside is a constant insecurity. It is when smiling, but the heart still feels lacking. It is when being next to loved ones but still feeling lonely. It is when having everything but still not feeling it is enough. It is when being silent for a moment and panicking because one doesn't know who one is if one does nothing. Many people are living in this level of suffering of conditioned states without realizing they are suffering. They are busy, successful, have packed schedules, but just need night to fall, just need to lie down, for emptiness to rush in again, just a small criticism, and the whole ego structure collapses, just not being recognized, and the heart wavers. Suffering at this point is no longer an event but a state of existence. These three levels of suffering are not separate. They nest within each other, feed each other, and transform back and forth. And if not seen clearly, humans will continue to find ways to quench suffering with all means of entertainment, shopping, dating, idealization, formal religious practice, or toxic positivity, but all of these only touch the surface. None of them reach the root level. Only when humans stop completely, no longer seeking to end suffering, no longer covering suffering with beautiful words, no longer using morality to shield it, does suffering begin to tell the truth. It points out that the root of all pain lies not in circumstances, but in the way the mind is operating. And when this seeing is clear enough, suffering is no longer mistaken for an enemy. It becomes a guiding sign. When the structure of suffering is seen, a very familiar reflex appears, the desire to escape as fast as possible. Humans are not used to staying with uncomfortable things. The moment the mind touches suffering, it immediately finds an exit. And that very reflex, so subtle it is hard to recognize, becomes the loop that causes suffering to continue being born. In modern life, that reflex often wears very beautiful forms. People call it positive thinking, healing, self-love, inner growth. But if observed deeply enough, one will see that many of those are not seeing suffering but avoiding suffering through a different path. Suffering is displaced, not resolved. When in pain, people try to be cheerful. When insecure, they find ways to reassure themselves. When empty, people fill up. A familiar phrase is repeated like a spell. Everything will be fine. But is it really? How many times have people smiled while their hearts were breaking? How many times have they written down things to be grateful for when their hearts were just a void? How many times have they told themselves to be strong, to be positive, to overcome? But just a small incident is enough to make it all collapse. The Buddha did not teach painting over suffering. He did not teach replacing suffering with more pleasant emotions. He taught looking straight, looking at pain without running away, looking at insecurity without rushing to justify, looking at the void in the heart without immediately finding something to fill it. Suffering needs to be seen as it is, without makeup, without judgment, without attaching moral names to it. Just like when the body is wounded, the first task is not to cover the wound to make it look pretty, but to clean the blood, see the cut clearly, and let it breathe. The mind is the same. Only when there is enough courage to sit down with sadness, not demanding it disappear, does something begin to move from within. Overcoming suffering does not lie in changing circumstances. Circumstances are inherently impermanent and beyond control. Overcoming suffering also does not lie in positivizing, because positivity can easily become a mask concealing the fear of negativity. Overcoming suffering is seeing suffering without being a victim of it. There is a very subtle difference here. Knowing you are sad does not mean you must stop being sad. Knowing you are hurt does not mean you must immediately heal. Knowing the heart is turbulent does not mean forcing a pose of a peaceful person. When one no longer forces oneself to be okay, the mind begins to soften, and that very softness is the condition to see deeply. The truth has the power to liberate, not because it is pleasant, but because when seen correctly, all burdens are dropped. Humans do not need to become positive to live rightly. They just need to become real. That reality is not flashy, not impressive, but it cuts very deep. It cuts off the need to play a role, to prove, to achieve an ideal state. When seen correctly, suffering may still be there, but it is no longer shackles. It is like a cloud drifting across the sky. Clouds come, clouds go. The sky does not need to chase the clouds away, nor does it fear the rain. The sky is just vast. And when the mind begins to realize it can be that vast, suffering is no longer something to fight but something that can be looked through. Once humans are used to dodging suffering, They will also very easily confuse seeing the truth with grabbing a new belief to cling to. Some hear that they must accept, so they try to appear accepting. Some hear that they must let go, so they force themselves to let go. Some hear they must be peaceful, so they put on a calm appearance. But deep inside, suffering remains intact, just pushed down to a deeper, more discreet level. The Buddha did not teach humans to become a better version of themselves. He taught seeing clearly what is. This difference is very subtle, but decides the entire path. When trying to become better, the mind is still resisting the present. When trying to be peaceful, the mind is still denying insecurity. When trying to be enlightened, the mind is still running away from the unenlightened. And so, whether under the name of spiritual practice or healing, suffering still operates silently. There is a common illusion that peace is a state free of suffering, that when one practices enough, understands enough, lives rightly enough, suffering will disappear. But that is not what the Buddha pointed out. Peace is not the absence of suffering. Peace is the full presence with everything that is existing, including suffering. No adding, no subtracting, no pushing away, no holding back. When suffering arises, the familiar reaction is to hate it, blame it, want it to disappear as fast as possible. But that very attitude is what gives power to suffering, because every time the mind says it shouldn't be like this, it has separated itself from reality, and from that separation, insecurity is born. Suffering dominates not because it is strong, but because we resist it. Some people think that if one just looks straight at suffering like that, one will become negative. But one needs to distinguish very clearly between pessimism and seeing the truth. Pessimism is looking at life through the lens of disappointment and believing there is no way out. Seeing the truth is looking at life without any lens at all, no pink, no black, no painting over, just seeing. If a person is lost in a forest, the pessimist will sit down and complain there is no way out. The blind optimist will close their eyes and run, hoping for luck. Those who see clearly will climb high, look at the whole picture, and know there is a path, but it must be walked correctly. The Buddha did not advise humans to hope, nor did he advise despair. He only advised seeing. When a person begins to ask the right questions, suffering no longer paralyzes them. Why is this suffering born? Where does it come from in the mind? What is being held onto? Those questions are not meant to find quick answers. They aim to open a space for observation, and in that space, one is no longer a victim but becomes a learner. Seeing the truth clearly does not make humans lose faith. It only takes away illusions. No more blind hope for a tomorrow without suffering. No more begging someone to come and save. No more waiting for an ideal state to begin living. Instead, there is a very quiet proactivity, living with what is, looking, understanding, and transforming from within. A person can be in pain without being attached to the pain, can be sad without being dragged away by the sadness, can live in the midst of life without being led by the nose by life. That is not living positively. That is living truthfully. No running, no painting, no denying. And when that truthfulness is deep enough, suffering is no longer an opponent but becomes a silent guide. When humans begin to live with the seeing, instead of living with ideas about who they should become, a very silent shift occurs. Not noisy, not dramatic, but deep. Suffering does not disappear. It still comes, but it no longer stands at the center. It is no longer the thing that decides every reaction, every thought, every action. Previously, every time suffering appeared, the mind immediately contracted. Contracted out of fear, contracted out of resistance, contracted out of non-acceptance. But when the mechanism of suffering is clearly seen, the mind no longer rushes to do anything with it. No pushing away, no holding back, just seeing and breathing with that seeing. And that very non-intervention dissolves many layers of tension originally created by resistance. Here, a point that is easily misunderstood needs to be clarified. Seeing suffering is not giving up, not enduring, not accepting and helplessness. Seeing suffering is no longer identifying oneself with suffering. Suffering comes, but there is no longer the story of I am the suffering person. My life is miserable. My fate is bitter. There is only a phenomenon happening in the body and mind, rising and then ceasing. When there is no longer identification, suffering loses its greatest power, the power that makes humans believe they are victims. When that belief dissolves, suffering has no ground to cling to. It is still present but like a guest passing by, no longer the occupier of the house. Many people think that spiritual practice is to reach a state free of pain, but the Buddha never promised that. He did not teach humans to make life smooth. He taught changing the way one looks at life, and when the view changes, the entire life experience changes with it. Not because circumstances are different, but because the mind is no longer bound as before. When the seeing ripens, a very strange type of peace is born. It is not euphoric, not high-flying, not making one feel invincible. It is quiet and unconditional. It does not depend on whether today has happy or sad events. It is not taken away when everything collapses, because it is not built on the foundation of control. This peace does not come from avoiding suffering. It comes from a deep intimacy with everything that is existing, including loss, including confusion, including unhealed pain. When no longer demanding life to be smooth, suffering has no foundation to stand firm. It has nothing left to oppose. Right here, humans begin to understand why the Buddha said life is suffering, but was not pessimistic. Pessimism is seeing suffering and closing up. But here, seeing suffering opens up understanding, opens up awakening, opens up the path to liberation which lies not in the future but right and the way of living and seeing now. And when one has gone to the very end of this seeing, one no longer asks how to end suffering. That question falls away on its own, replaced by a silent presence, breathing, feeling, knowing clearly every movement of body and mind. No need to add anything, no need to subtract anything, only the truth revealing itself moment by moment. When stepping into this depth, suffering is no longer seen as an incident to be fixed but as a knock on the door. Not a knock to beg for pity, nor to punish, just to remind that there is something in the mind that needs to be seen. And precisely because humans are used to living with their backs turned to what is uncomfortable, that knock is often misunderstood as an enemy. The first reaction whenever suffering comes is usually hatred, hating the heavy feeling, hating the insecurity, hating the uninvited thoughts. The mind wants to push it away very fast, wants to return to the stable state. But the more one wants suffering to disappear, the tighter suffering clings, not because suffering intentionally causes harm, but because resistance has fed it and made it grow. When the mind says it shouldn't be like this, that very sentence has erected a wall between oneself and reality. Suffering does not come to destroy life. It comes to break the illusions that humans are holding onto. The illusions that one must always be strong, must always be positive, must always control everything, must always follow the path mapped out. And when reality does not match those images, suffering appears as a force pulling back, forcing humans to stop. If looking back honestly, the deepest turning points in a human life rarely come when one is happy. They come when falling, when losing what one once clung to, when all plans collapse, when there is no road left to run. It is precisely then that the true questions begin to ring out. Not questions to find solutions, but questions about the truth of oneself. Many people step onto the path of practice not because they love philosophy, but because they have suffered to the point where they are no longer capable of pretending. They sit down not to achieve anything, but because they cannot continue living as before. And in that moment of letting go of all effort, something very different begins to appear. Not a dazzling light, but a vibrant silence. For the first time, the mind no longer runs away from itself. In this view, suffering is no longer an opponent. It becomes the first teacher, stern, honest, and yielding, but also compassionate in a very strange way. Because no one points out oneself more clearly than suffering. No one wears down the ego faster than an unannounced crisis. And no one pulls humans back to the present more deeply than unavoidable pain. The Buddha did not come to take suffering out of human life. He also did not promise that this path would be pleasant. He pointed out one thing. What hurts humans the most is not suffering, but not daring to look at suffering. When covering suffering with names like heavy karma, fate, lack of blessings, or using morality to shield it, suffering does not disappear, it just retreats inside, waiting for a moment of weakness to rise up stronger. Seeing suffering in the spirit of liberation is not analyzing or explaining. It is staying fully with what is happening in the body and mind, seeing anger when it arises, seeing desire when it surges, seeing fear when it trembles in the chest, seeing without judging, without giving it beautiful names, without concluding, without seeking to become different. And when that seeing is quiet enough, deep enough, suffering reveals its nature on its own, arising and ceasing, coming and going, having no fixed subject. When the seeing is deep enough to no longer dodge, a very great truth gradually reveals itself. Suffering does not make humans become worse. Suffering makes humans become more real. Real in the sense of no longer having a shell to show off, no longer having a role to keep, no longer having an ideal image to protect. Only a human breathing, feeling, present with all that is. At this point, many familiar concepts begin to collapse. Some think one must be strong to overcome suffering, but the very idea of must be strong makes the mind tense up. Some think one must understand many philosophies to be liberated, but understanding without daring to face one's own suffering is just accumulating concepts. Some believe practice is to become noble, stable, and shakable, but the Buddha never set such a standard. He pointed out the path of seeing clearly. When seeing clearly, suffering is no longer viewed as an enemy to be exterminated. It becomes a mirror reflecting the places in the mind that still grasp, still fear, still seek to control. Every time suffering rises is a time that mirror appears. If one turns their face away, the mirror is still there. If one dares to stand straight before it, no lipstick, no dodging, then in that very moment, a form of very deep freedom begins to appear. This freedom does not come from things going smoothly. It comes from no longer being defined by circumstances. A person can be unemployed without seeing themselves as a failure. A person can be lonely without seeing themselves as lacking. A person can be in pain without the mind contracting in resistance. Not because circumstances have changed, but because the view is different. The Buddha did not come to change the world. He came to change the way humans look at the world. When the view changes, every experience changes with it. Suffering can still come, but it no longer leads. It is like waves passing over a lake. The lake needs to do nothing with the waves. It doesn't run after them, nor does it chase them away. It is just wide enough to contain them. Here, a very important thing needs to be emphasized. Liberation is not a state of no more suffering. Liberation is no longer being bound by suffering, no longer identifying oneself with what arises and ceases, no longer believing that this emotion, this thought, this circumstance is me. When identification dissolves, suffering loses its basis for existence as a ruler. Many people pray to the Buddha for peace, for less suffering, to overcome adversity. But the truth is the Buddha does not grant peace, nor does he take suffering away from anyone. He only shows humans that one does not need to end suffering to be on the right path. One just needs to start seeing clearly what is happening in one's own body, mind, and environment. That very seeing is already the first step of liberation. When no longer trying to become someone else, no longer striving to reach an ideal state, no longer expecting life to be as smooth as desired, the mind begins to settle down very naturally, not because it is forced to be quiet, but because there is nothing left to resist against. And in that settling, peace germinates, not noisy, not showy, but durable. When no longer resisting suffering, one also no longer chases after peace. A very simple but profound thing begins to appear. Humans stop seeking, not because they have found something huge, but because they see clearly that there is nothing left that needs to be found. All running ends here, not by victory, but by stopping. Humans have gone very far to find happiness, gone through knowledge, rituals, methods, concepts, gone through promises of enlightenment, liberation, peace, but perhaps never once truly sat down with their own suffering. Never once let suffering be fully present, not shielded by ideals, not covered by morality, not soothed by beautiful words. Suffering is feared to the point of having to be dressed in all kinds of coats. And so, suffering is not seen as it is. Enlightenment, in this view, is not a final glorious state. It is not a peak to reach. It is a very simple seeing that there is nothing left to run from, nothing left to embellish, nothing needs to be become. When humans no longer try to be a peaceful person, no longer strive to be a correct practitioner, no longer aspire to live according to some ideal image, the mind becomes empty in a very healing way. And that void, peace, is not created. It presents itself, not the kind of happiness that excites people, but a deep quiet, unconditional. It does not depend on whether today has happy or sad events, does not disappear when everything collapses, because it is not built on the foundation of everything having to go one's way. Here, a core point needs to be reiterated. There is no need to end suffering to walk the right path. The path of liberation does not demand humans to be perfect, does not demand to be stable, does not demand to be enlightened according to any mold. It only demands one single thing: the courage to live truly with what is true with suffering, true with joy, true with doubt, true with pain, no explaining, no judging, no lipstick. When a person can sit still with what is, whether pleasant or uncomfortable, whether light or dark, whether beautiful or ugly, they have touched the deepest foundation of the path of liberation, not because suffering has disappeared, but because it no longer makes them afraid. And when no longer afraid, suffering loses its final power. At that time, humans live in the midst of life without being led by the nose by life, needing no proof, no comparison, no haste. Every step is full, because no one is running away, and no one is chasing. There is only life happening, very real, very naked, and very free. And perhaps right in that sincere silence, what the Buddha saw under the Bodhi tree quietly appears, not as a blinding light, but as a quiet clarity where humans stop seeking, stop resisting, stop fearing. And right there, no need to go anywhere else. The path is already underfoot.